The courtroom hummed with subdued whispers as attendees found their places. The judge's bench towered above, a formidable emblem of power and, for some, fear. Daniel, a sharply dressed black man, stood poised at the defendant's table, his stance erect, his eyes steady. His polished suit and composed presence stood in stark contrast to the scowl on Judge Harper's face. She struck her gavel once, silencing the lingering murmurs. "Let's get this over with," she grumbled, her irritation barely concealed. "I don't have time for foolishness." Daniel arched an eyebrow but held his silence, awaiting her next move. He was familiar with this demeanor, the dismissive stare, the patronizing tone. It was all too recognizable. Judge Harper leaned forward. "People like you always believe the rules don't apply, always seeking a shortcut," she sneered, her voice thick with scorn. A few gasps rippled through the room. The court stenographer paused briefly before resuming her typing. Daniel stayed composed, though the slight didn't go unnoticed. "Excuse me, Your Honor," he responded, his voice steady. "You heard me," she shot back. "You people always try to game the system, thinking you can stroll in here and demand special treatment." A heavy hush blanketed the room. Even the bailiff shifted uneasily. Daniel drew a slow, deliberate breath. He had encountered prejudice before, but never so overt in a courtroom. Reaching into his pocket, he produced a small badge and held it aloft for all to see. "I had hoped for fair treatment today," he said, his voice resonant with authority. "But it seems I'll need to clarify who I truly am." Judge Harper scoffed, her lips twisting into a smirk as she reclined in her chair. "And what's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. She barely glanced at the badge, dismissing it as a feeble ploy to undermine her authority. Daniel remained unruffled, setting the badge on the defendant's table where it glinted under the courtroom lights. "I'm Special Agent Daniel Carter with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he declared, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The prosecutor, who had been sifting through documents, froze. The bailiff straightened his posture. Even the spectators leaned forward, eyes widening. Judge Harper, however, rolled her eyes and let out a dry chuckle. "Nice try," she sneered. "Do you really think flashing a fake badge will get you out of this?" Daniel didn't waver. He calmly reached into his other pocket, retrieving an official ID, and stepped forward to place it on the bench before the judge. "You're welcome to verify it, Your Honor," he said, his tone resolute. Judge Harper hesitated, her smirk faltering for a moment before returning. "Even if that were true," she said, attempting to regain control, "it doesn't change that you're standing before me as a defendant." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "That's where you're mistaken, Judge," he replied. "I'm actually here on official business, and after what you just said, that business now includes you." A wave of shock coursed through the courtroom. The murmurs resumed, louder now. Judge Harper shifted uncomfortably, but quickly masked it with another scoff. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I run this courtroom," she snapped. "You have no authority here." Daniel offered a knowing smile. "That's where you're wrong, Judge," he said. "And you're about to discover just how wrong you are." Judge Harper narrowed her eyes at Daniel, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She glanced at the ID again, as if willing it to be fraudulent, but the official FBI emblem was unmistakable. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, stealing a glance at the bailiff, who now appeared uncertain about his next move. The audience whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Daniel and the judge. "You expect me to just take your word for it?" Harper scoffed, gripping the edge of her bench. "This is my courtroom. I decide what happens here." Daniel remained calm, turning slightly to address the bailiff. I suggest you verify my credentials. Call the bureau. You'll find my authority outranks hers." His words were firm yet measured, and the bailiff hesitated. For the first time, Judge Harper appeared genuinely unsettled. The bailiff looked to the judge, awaiting her reaction. Harper waved a dismissive hand. "This is absurd," she muttered. "We're done here." She reached for her gavel, preparing to move on to the next case, but Daniel wasn't finished. "Actually, Judge," he said, stepping forward, "you're the one who's done." The words landed like a hammer. Harper froze, her fingers tightening around the gavel. "Excuse me," she hissed, her face reddening. Daniel pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "This is a federal warrant," he said, unfolding it slowly for the entire courtroom to see, "for your arrest." The gasps in the room were deafening. The prosecutor nearly dropped his pen. The bailiff took an involuntary step forward, his eyes darting between Daniel and the judge. Harper let out a dry laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is a joke," she muttered. "This has to be a joke." Daniel remained silent, letting the weight of his words settle. The bailiff, realizing the gravity of the situation, cautiously took the document from Daniel's hand, his eyes scanning the paper. Judge Harper's smug expression began to fade as she watched the bailiff's face change. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The power she had always wielded so effortlessly was slipping away. She was no longer the judge commanding the courtroom. Now, she was the one on trial. Judge Harper's hands clenched around her gavel as her face twisted in disbelief. The courtroom was no longer hers to command. The bailiff, after carefully reviewing the warrant, looked up at her, his expression a mix of hesitation and duty. The silence was stifling. Everyone in the room awaited what would happen next. This is ridiculous," Harper stammered, her voice stripped of its former authority. "You think you can just waltz in here and pull a stunt like this? I am a judge. I decide who gets arrested in my courtroom." Daniel didn't flinch. He simply crossed his arms and nodded toward the bailiff. "She's stalling. You've read the warrant. You know what needs to be done." The bailiff hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "I need you to stand up." Harper let out a sharp laugh, but it lacked humor. "Oh, you can't be serious," she snapped. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea how much power I have?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Not anymore." The tension in the room snapped like a thunderclap. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps as reality sank in. Harper's face drained of color. She looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. The prosecutor averted his gaze. The clerk kept typing, and even the officers at the back of the room stood still, waiting for what came next. The bailiff stepped closer. "Judge Harper, please," he said, his voice slow but firm. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Harper's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the bench. "This isn't happening," she whispered, shaking her head. But then, as if flipping a switch, she straightened her posture and glared at Daniel. "You think you've won?" she spat. "This is just a mistake. I'll be back on this bench in no time, and when I am, you won't." Daniel cut in, his voice calm but final. "Your corruption ends today." The bailiff reached for his handcuffs. Harper's breath hitched, and for the first time in her career, she felt something she had never experienced in her own courtroom: fear. The metallic click of the handcuffs reverberated through the silent courtroom as the bailiff secured Judge Harper's wrists. She flinched, her face contorted with disbelief and rage. The authority she had abused for years was now being stripped away in front of everyone. The murmurs in the room grew louder, some in shock, others in quiet satisfaction. "This is a disgrace," Harper hissed, struggling against the cuffs. "You have no right to do this to me." Daniel remained calm, watching as the once powerful judge was led away from her own bench like any other criminal. "You abused your position for too long," he said, stepping forward. "The law doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people." The prosecutor, still stunned, adjusted his tie before standing. "Given the circumstances," he said carefully, "I believe this case should be dismissed immediately." The gavel, no longer in Harper's hands, was brought down by a substitute judge. Case dismissed. As Daniel turned to leave, the crowd erupted in applause. He walked out of the courtroom victorious, knowing justice had finally been served.